Hello, and welcome to Ready, Set, Capture, an introduction to OpenEdge 11.7 Change Data Capture. Before we get started, there are a couple of housekeeping slides. Let's take a closer look at the control panel to show you how you can participate. First, to open and hide your control panel, you want to click on the orange highlighted arrow at the top, shown here. Then, there are two options for joining audio. To use Voice over IP, simply select Mic and Speakers under Audio, or to dial in using your phone, select Telephone, and dial in using the numbers and information provided. Lastly, all lines will be muted for today's webinar, but we will have a live Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you have a question at any time during this webinar, simply submit your question via the Questions section of the webinar control panel located at the top right of your screen. We will collect all questions through this Questions panel and address them at the end of the presentation. Now we're ready to get started. Our speaker today is Brian Bowman, Senior Principal OpenEdge Product Manager. Brian?
Thanks, Tanya. Welcome, everybody. Today we're going to talk about OpenEdge 11.7 Change Data Capture. We're going to go through and I'm going to talk to you about a little introduction of Change Data Capture. Why should you choose Change Data Capture, or CDC? We're going to talk about the architectural overview. What does it look like from an architecture standpoint? What's it take to implement it? How does it work? I'm going to go through and demonstrate for you very simply how you enable it, how you can do it all online, and how that process goes, and show you some little bit of data in terms of what data looks like whenever you capture that data. And we'll finish up with our next steps. Where can you go for more information? And how do you get started with CDC? So starting off with an introduction to Change Data Capture. The question really is why do you want to capture data that's changed? This really drives your business decisions in terms of being able to take data. Everybody today wants to be able to take data and export it to other locations, be it a consolidated repository, a data warehouse, or a data lake, to be able to take that data from an OLTP or an online transaction processing system and be able to use it someplace else, be able to mine that data. The goal here is you need to minimize your time and effort. Historically, being able to export that data is done in typically a daily batch process, so you're always looking at older data as opposed to looking at current information. Also, historically, people replicate all of the data to the data warehouse, take all of the data out every night and reload it and repopulate your data warehouse. Very inefficient when it comes to processing and time spent and need. So it's really, and that data very quickly, since it's a day old, becomes irrelevant to the requirements and what the business needs to be productive and active in today's digital world. So there's a lot of benefits from using a Change Data Capture, a CDC, a solution, which is really focused to that application and to that database that application is running on. The important thing to understand from an OpenEdge standpoint, Change Data Capture, CDC will capture the data regardless of whether it's an ABL update, create, update, or delete, or a SQL create, update, or delete. It's one single solution. So at a very high level, if we look at Change Data Capture, it runs against the OpenEdge database, inside the OpenEdge database. That data is then taken and through a third-party ETL tool or data extraction tool to extract, transform, or load, or an ETL tool, can be loaded into a single or multiple different data stores, depending on what you need on the other end to be able to capture that data. So some features, some specific things about CDC. It's really an alternative. Before CDC and OpenEdge 11.7, there were other alternatives for you. OpenEdge auditing was introduced in OpenEdge 10.2b. It is designed for non-repudiated auditing solutions whenever you need to prove that somebody updated a record at some specific time and guarantee that that data is updated. That's what the design and architecture of OpenEdge auditing does for you, creates for you. Another alternative, and so we've had customers that have taken OpenEdge auditing and tried to make that work as truly a Change Data Capture or CDC, just to capture what changed in the record, what changed in the tables at the fields. A lot of work to be able to go and manipulate and work with that data. Another alternative that people have looked at and they are using are ABL replication triggers. These are triggers that fire on the client side, so they're replication triggers. You have to go write your own ABL code. You have to go deploy that code and continue to manage and work through that code. The other challenge with ABL replication triggers is you have to write information into your tables to be able to understand what's being updated, what's being captured, that type of information. The flip side of that, on the SQL side, are Java stored procedures. They do very much the same thing as ABL replication triggers can do, but on the SQL side. So if you're doing an update on the OpenEdge SQL Server database, you have to write a Java stored procedure. So if you find yourself in the situation where you're running ABL and SQL against the same database, you have to work and maintain two separate solutions to be able to achieve the same capture of changes across your database and your fields and tables within your data. So one thing to understand about CDC, it's very flexible in terms of configuration. You can capture any data at the field level if it changed, and we'll go into more detail about what you can capture and the differences between what you can capture. But it's very flexible. Very easy to modify through a browser-based solution, or you could also programmatically go through and modify what's being captured based on the policy information. The data is stored in a change table or a shadow table, as it were, with the same data type, same data structure of the original data, without converting it to any other types of fields or to character fields or anything like that. So one of the limitations of the OpenEdge auditing or challenges with OpenEdge auditing is the field levels need to be managed. And then lastly, one of the more important things is you don't have to change your application to enable CDC and run change data capture against your database. So 0 application changes are required to start capturing that data. Processing that data, we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's look a little bit at the architecture overview, just from a very high level, so you have a better understanding of how CDC is designed from an architecture standpoint. So as we've said, you can identify changes that happen from OLTP transactions. Those are creates, updates, and deletes that happen against your production database. In this picture, it shows your data source. So you have your source data, you have your source tables, and then you have CDC, the capture process that happens inside the database engine. As those changes occur, that data is written out to a change table, or change data is captured out into a change table. And then you would go use a third-party tool to be able to do the ETL, the extract, transform, and load, process that data, and load it into a data warehouse, or wherever else you need to be able to work with it. Again, that right side, the data warehouse, can be multiple different data stores, different locations, different types of data, whatever type of database or environment you need to be able to extract that data and use it for. Again, this works whether it's ABL or SQL, doesn't really matter. So looking specifically at CDC as opposed to the larger architecture picture, it's an internal trigger-based capture mechanism. It creates, updates, and deletes. It stores that data in a relational database, very similar, if not structures, still similar to your original source tables. So the change data actually goes into tables and fields and levels. It's defined through a policy mechanism. So you define a policy for your CDC table, for your table, and then those policies determine what we track and how we capture it. And then it just tracks and captures that change data. So let's look a little bit at the table overview, internal of the database, the meta schema or the schema of change data capture and what happens in there. We start with our source table. This is your user data. In my example, I'm going to use the customer table. Standard table in the Sports 2000 database. So good table to give us an example of what things can look like. So from my source table, I enable CDC on this source table. Once I've enabled that CDC, enabling CDC creates two additional tables in the database, a CDC table policy table and a CDC field policy table. And based on what type of data, how the data you're capturing, we will write to one or both of these tables. These are really where the policies are defined, how those policies are set up, and what happens whenever you enable, or when you make a policy active or inactive. So from that, for performance reasons, we take that policy information and store it in a cache in memory. Important thing just to understand that's how we make it a little bit more performant from CDC's standpoint. So then if I go out and once CDC is enabled, I created a policy against it. I create an update or a delete against the database, against that table, specifically the customer table. And an internal CDC trigger, database trigger will fire. Effectively, a database trigger will fire. It will read that policy information, say, okay, I need to go capture this information. I need to store it. This is the policy level I'm working with. And then it writes it out to a tracking table. So at a transaction level, it writes a tracking record for each of the transactions that completes. Now, this is important to understand because in the event that I have a transaction that spans 2 different tables, I have one CDC change tracking record for that whole transaction that might span those 2 tables. In our example or our demo today, we're just going to focus on the customer table, a single table, but that's where the CDC change tracking table comes into play as you're working through that. Finally, that internal database trigger writes out to the actual data table for your change. In our example, it's CDC underscore capture, CDC underscore customer. In our example, it's the CDC underscore customer table. That's where the captured data of what you've changed and how much you've changed. If you choose to capture at the field level changes, where that gets stored. So looking at that change table, that last table I just talked about, this is really an example of what the CDC underscore customer table would look like. If I look at it, it's really 2 sections to it. In every CDC change table that we capture data in, there's a set of metadata columns. It gives things like, it helps you identify and sort and identify how records are written, what those records are, a timestamp, as well as a change sequence for those tables. This becomes the metadata in terms of how that record gets processed and how you store and keep that data from a metadata standpoint. Also, in that same table are your user data columns. Now, these are the columns that you've decided you want to capture within the table. In this example, we're capturing the customer number, the name, and the discount. So those are the 3 fields that we decided we wanted to capture against our customer table. For the change table, that's what the schema looks like of that data. You can access and read any of this data to be able to go use it and to be able to manipulate it and work with that information. So that's the structure of the metadata and the schema of the fields themselves. Let's look for a second at the indexes. This is an example of the same table, the indexes for that same table, the CDC underscore customer. And you'll notice there are effectively 3 indexes. One's the change sequence ID, which is the ID of the order of the change sequence. The change sequence IDs guarantees the order of how that data has been changed or how that data has been captured. Not necessarily a time sequence. Time sequence is the time that change was made. It may not correspond specifically to the change sequence. That's why we capture both the change sequence and the time sequence for that is in terms of indexes and data columns out of that. The third index is really kind of a user-defined index. If you decide you want to make a record you need to identify what fields are going to make that record unique for you. You can pull out and identify those fields and put the order into those fields that you want to capture that data. That index, that identifying fields index, is the index that you can use to go access and manipulate your data based on that information. So from an index standpoint, those are the 3 indexes that you would typically see when you're going to work with CDC. So what does it take and implement CDC? We talked about the architecture, we talked about the schema. Let's talk a little bit about how do we go, what steps do we need to go through whenever it comes to implementation. So as we walk through this, the first obviously important thing you need to decide is determine what data you want to capture. And whether you want to capture 1 field, whether you want to capture 5 fields, whether you want to capture all the fields, that's really important. And when you capture that data, if you just want to capture that the record changed, you can determine that as well. But when you capture that data, do you want to just capture the result set, what the current record is, or do you want to capture the previous state of that record and the current record? That's an important decision as well. We'll talk about that when we talk about policy levels in just a minute. Next, you enable CDC against the database. Very straightforward, easy process. Then you set up a policy for each of the tables you want to capture. We'll talk about how, and as I go through and demonstrate this, we'll go through these first 4 steps and show you a little bit about how this works. set up a policy for the table, and then you enable that policy for the table. You can do steps 3 and 4 together. I will demonstrate and do them as separate steps, just so you have an idea of what happens along the way and what you can do and how you can go modify things before you enable the policy against the table. The fifth step is really running your ETL process, whether it's an internal process, whether you write ABL or SQL against to extract that data, to pull that data out and load it someplace else, or whether you're using a third-party ETL like Talend or Pentaho PDI or something like that, some external data transfer information. And finally, that data is still out there in the OpenEdge database. Part of your management process of the data, the change data, is you need to go delete that or clean up that transferred data, the change tracking records, as well as the actual change data itself. So that's part of the process you have to build into that as you work through that. So that's really opening, that's the process you need to go through to be able to implement CDC. Important thing to understand, this can all be done online. As we move forward, everything that we work through is we're going to be focused on doing these types of implementations all online as you're doing processing against the database. So looking a little bit in terms of different policy levels, I've touched on this a little bit previously throughout different discussions, but there are really different policy levels and what type of data you can capture. With level 0, which is the minimal level, you really just captured that the row changed, that a record changed. You're not capturing any data of what changed. You have no idea which fields changed. You're just capturing effectively a date and timestamp and a sequence ID that record changed. This can be valuable whenever you're doing nightly processing. You need to know what records changed, but you really don't care what types of data or what changed within the record. Just knowing that the record changed can be very valuable when it comes to nighttime processing. Level 1 is really the level 0. These all build on top of each other. And level 1 also includes a field map of what fields changed. We don't capture the actual data that changed, but we do capture the customer name and the discount changed, so that you know which fields changed when you go back to that level 0 and level 1. Level 2 is everything that happens in level 1, plus the current value or the changed field values. So this is typically I went out and changed my record. I want to capture, I changed my customer number 3 times throughout the day. I'm going to capture what fields changed and the result of those changed all 3 times. So all 3 sets of records. So I'll have 3 sets of records for my customer record. And finally, the highest level, the level 3, which is the maximum. In this level, we capture the current change values and the previous change values as well. So that's the difference between level 3. It'll capture both what it looked like before the change and what it looked like after the change. 3 different policy levels. So how these levels are set determines what happens inside the database, what data is captured, what tables and fields are created in respect to that as well. Let's talk about that for just a minute. So when we look at table level policies, with a level 0 policy, we just captured the rows changed. The change tables are not created, and obviously the change tables are not written to either. So it's just that change tracking table. With level 1, we capture the change field map. We update a change field map. We also capture the change table, but the actual change table records are not written out to the table. So with level 2, we create a change table, and we create a change table with a record with the current value in that table. At level 3, we capture the current values, and then we capture the previous values as well. So there are 2 records, and it's important to note between level 2 and level 3. Level 2 is a single record with the current values or the final values. Level 3 creates 2 records, one with the previous values and one with the current values as you work through that. So now we've talked about all this stuff. Let's drill down and talk a little bit about how can we enable CDC through our processing. So enabling CDC can be done online or offline. Again, I said it can all be done online with the database up and running in production. That's really important to understand. From an online standpoint, you can do it through OpenEdge Explorer or OpenEdge Management. browser-based tool. That's how we will do it today to show you what that looks and how do you be able to do that. You could also do it from the command line, and my command line example that I show below actually will work the same way whether the database is online or offline. So if we need to script this to be able to automatically enable CDC for your database, if you have multiple databases, or you want to go off and do all that, you can go script this and create that capability to be able to do it as well. If the database is offline, you can still use OpenEdge management to do it, but there's some limitations in terms of lookups and dropdowns and selecting that you can't do. So you actually have to be able to know which areas you need to go work with, which table area, which data area, and which index area by area name that you want to go deal with before you get to that. So offline is a little bit harder, but we don't have the ability to go query the database and bring this information back for you. That's what it takes to be able to enable CDC online or offline. So how does it work? The best way for me to do this is to give you a demo of how we go through this process and show you how it works on a system. So here we have OpenEdge 11.7 with OpenEdge management up and running. I've already created a database called SDemo. It's actually an S2K, Sports 2000 database that's running out there. I've started the database up, so it's running. I'm in the database administration console or the admin console in the database administration tab. So let's go look out. As you can see here, I have standard OpenEdge database. I have some things enabled, VSTs. I do not have change data capture enabled. So the first step in that process, remember, is we just need to go enable change data capture. So I go out here and go to enable change data capture. And first it lets me choose what data I'm going to store my data index. Remember there's the table policies and the table change policy. It's looking for areas where I can store that data. So if I go out and choose here, you notice, by default that I have no areas available. CDC requires type 2 storage areas. By default, our Sports 2000 database doesn't have type 2 areas. So let me go add these areas before I get back to this point. So I'm going to go back out here to my command line, and I'm going to add the structure area, prostruct online, do a prostruct add online, adding my storage areas for CDC. Now you notice the areas that I created a CDC tracking area, a CDC index area, and in this example, my original demo, or my complete demo is I'm looking to capture data from the employee record, the customer record, the order record, and the sales rep record. So I create a specific storage area for each of those four sets of tables. How you design it, how you can set that up, you can put them all into a single area or single storage area if you want to. It's really up to you as for how you want to go out and set that up. This is how I set it up for us. So now if we go back to our browser, and now we go to enable change data capture, and I go out and select my data areas, and now we see that those type 2 storage areas show up. Now if you already have type 2 storage areas in your database, they would show up on this list as well. You probably don't want to mix, as a best practice, mix your CDC data and your storage areas data. So just as a general rule. So again, for my data area, for my tracking information, I'm going to put it in the CDC tracking area. For my index data, I created a CDC and index area for that. So that's really where it's going to go store that index data. So now, those are the only two things I have to choose to be able to enable CDC against my database. I can choose to deactivate those indexes. I just want to make them active, any indexes against those, because it just makes the process easier, and I need to go through that. So with that, change data capture has been enabled against the database. So now I can go over here and I can see that change data capture has a green check mark. So it shows that it's enabled. Also, if we go down here into the bottom center section under my storage management area, I can now see that I have two active links. My change data capture table list and create a change data capture policy. So now that it's enabled, CDC is enabled against my database, I can go create a policy against that CDC data as well. Before I do that, I want to go out and show you what the structure looks like in terms of prostruct list against that database. So if I do You can see that my CDC sales rep, order, customer, employee, index area, and tracking area are out there. Variable type, different sets of areas and sets for that. So that's really what it does. And when I did a ProStruct add online, it went out and added that data to it. So let's go create a change data capture policy. As I go through this, I'm going to call this policy CDC_customer. As the customer is the policy table, I'm going to do this change against my database connection name in OpenEdge management is demo, so that's why that's there. And then I'm going to go choose, and it lets me go pick and choose which table I'm going to go create this policy against. So I'm creating it against my pub.customer. Remember those different levels, policy levels we talked about previously? They really fall into this level. I'm going to set it up as a medium. As you can show, since I chose anything other than 0, it comes up and asks me where I'm going to put my data at. Currently, we're going to leave this as inactive. So I'm going to go out here, select my data. So for this data area, where am I going to put it? This is my customer table. So I'm going to store it in my customer table. By default, it pre-fills that index area as the same table name, the same storage area. If I could have chosen an index area, added a CDC index area for customers as well. I chose not to do it in this example. So after that, the next step is to go down here and choose which fields I want to capture. And from this process, I'm going to go capture my customer number. Let's capture discount, and let's capture name. So those are the 3 fields I'm going to capture as I go through and do this processing, as I go through and update a CDC record. One additional thing I want to do, if we scroll back up to the top, there's a toggle button out here in terms of identifying fields. I want to be able to identify my customer number as my unique field to be able to capture that information or to create that index for that. So if I do that, I come back down here to customer number. You'll notice that enable identifying fields is now on. I can mark that to yes, and then I can set that to that's going to be the first field I'm going to capture. I can choose to capture and make identified fields, multiple fields. If I have multiple fields that I have to define to be able to capture that data, I can do that. And this is where you would set the order of those fields that occur within the index. So with that being done, I can go out here and I can submit this. And now I have a policy out here called CDC_policy. It's currently inactive, and it's in a pending state, which means it's ready to be activated. But if we go back into this, one other thing I wanted to show you, out here, as we work through this, there's another button up here at the top called Generate Policy Program. And this Generate Policy Program generates ABL code that you can go use to do everything that I just did through the ABL, through a program. So if I go click on this, I save my file, it's going to bring up a file that looks very similar to this. In fact, it's the exact same thing as this. So in terms of all the details, I'm not going to drill down into the details, but it's important to understand I'm creating a customer policy against the CDC_customer, change table, customer service area, where the areas I'm at. Notice that I'm capturing customer number, discount, and name down here. And so this is really a base level program that you can go out and modify, and that gives you the ability to go out and programmatically set up how you go create all these policies. So you don't have to go click through every single table to be able to create your policies. You can go create one, make it a template, build it in a template, and then use that to be able to create all your other policies for all your other tables. Important thing to understand that we give you that capability to be able to do that. So next, we have our policy, but it's still inactive. We've captured against the second level data, medium data. So let's go activate that policy. It's as easy as clicking on this and then submitting that. So now you can see that we have a current active policy. If I were to add another policy, if I were to go back and modify the policy, it would create a previous policy that would be inactive from an instant state or a state of a state of inactive. So I can have multiple policies as I walk through this for previous sets of records. In this example, I'm only using one policy. I have this policy. I've updated. It's available. Now, CDC is completely enabled against my database, and I can go out and I can update data, create data, and go look at that data. So let's go take a look at that in just a really simple example. So I have a really easy, straightforward .p out here. It goes out and actually does two different types of updates. And we'll go through and look at the two different types of updates that the CDC captures after we go through the processing. So if I run this update customer.p, it's going to go out and run up, and it's going to go update the first 10 records within the data, within my customer table. And we will capture changes for those first 10 records in the customer table as well. So from that, if I go look at how my customers look, what my rows actually look like at a very high level surface, this is our first record. We can see that it shows a change sequence of 1. There are a couple of other fields in here I'll come back and talk about in a minute. But you notice the customer number is 1. It's really finding the first customer, next customer, and rolls through that. Interestingly enough, I changed the name in this example, but I did not change the discount. Now remember, when we set up the policy originally, we captured all 3 fields: customer number, name, and discount. Now, I didn't change my customer number, but since it's an identifying field, we capture that data is there. We capture that change anyway. The name I changed from Liftline Skiing to customer and the number, customer 1, and I did not update the discount in this field, in this change. So we still kept the discount field because we're capturing all 3 fields, but it's an unknown value because I did not make any changes to it. Second record, third record, fourth record. You notice our change sequence changes as those work through that process as well. Now, with my 5th record, same way. Now, with my 6th record, the last 5 records, I went out and I updated the customer name, and I also updated the discount policy with a new value. So that's why we captured just the change. Remember, this is a medium level, capture 2. The customer number I changed, the customer name, customer number I left the same, customer name I changed, and the discount I updated or I changed as well. So it captures that information. So so understanding that, go back up to the top and talk a little bit about this. We talked about the time stamp. We talked about the change sequence, guarantee the order in terms of change sequence. The continuation field tells me whether this record has to be split for one reason or another. As you go out and look at the user assistant videos and drill down into CDC a little bit more detail, you understand that we may have to split records and create multiple records for one entry, whether it's an array index, whether it's a fragment, what number of fragments in that split record process we're going through. And then the operation. The operation is whether it's a create, an update, or a delete in terms of how does it go through and work through that. So that's what a CDC record looks like from start to finish. We went through, we created the policy, we enabled CDC against the database, we created the policy for the customer table, captured 3 fields, the customer number, the name, and the discount, enabled that, made it active, went through the whole process, and now we're out looking at the data. This is where you would take your ETL tool and plug into this, take this information out there and process it and work through all the information. And in this example, I updated 10 records. So that is a very high-level overview of how change data capture would work and how you might look at the data or be able to manipulate and work with the data. Now let's go back and talk about the next steps. Now that you've seen what CDC is, hopefully you're interested in it. You want to go out and look at it. One question that people always ask before I go into what the next steps are is, can you help me understand the differences between OpenEdge Change Data Capture and the OpenEdge Pro 2 product? And it's really relatively straightforward. Both of them require you to be on OpenEdge 11.7 to be able to make use of Change Data Capture. OpenEdge Change Data Capture is designed and is built for the need to be able to capture data at row level and or field level. So if you're capturing just that the row changed, CDC is an alternative for you. If you need to capture that that data change within individual fields, then CDC is the right tool for you. It's the tool that you need to use. If you're using additionally, if you're using an external ETL engine, to be able to extract that data out, then CDC is the right choice for you. Pro 2 historically has used those replication triggers that I've talked about, but Pro 2 version 5.1 in OpenEdge 11.7 also gives you the potential to use Change Data Capture or CDC as the capture mechanism only for Pro 2. One of the things with Pro 2 is it only captures row-level changes. So if you need to understand and capture data that's changing at the field level, you want to capture specific fields, then Pro 2 cannot do that for you. Also, Pro 2 can write to a SQL Server data server database, an Oracle database, or another OpenEdge database. So those are really the limitations of Pro 2 from that perspective. So when you're looking at the two, that's part of what you want to look at in terms of what is my business requirement, what am I trying to solve, and which tool can help me solve that problem. Okay, so to learn more about CDC, there's a couple of different areas where you can go. Out on YouTube, there are user assistance videos that walk you through a lot of the details, some of this architecture, and maybe take you a little bit deeper in terms of CDC internals and information. There's also online training. There's a class in our Progress e-learning community or PEC called Implementing Progress OpenEdge Change Data Capture. That's a new class that was just made available. So you can go out and run that class and go through that class and learn more details. And it has exercises to walk you through creating CDC and doing a lot of the work that we've worked through. And lastly, in Prague, we will have the EMEA Pug Challenge. This is in November. And we will run a CDC workshop there, a half-day workshop where you can get hands-on playing and training and working, and we'll go into much more detail about what CDC looks like, what the architecture is, and you'll be able to go out and actually implement CDC in a test environment and be able to work with it and play with it and understand how an ETL tool might extract data out of it, as well as how do you set up different policies within CDC. So that's a place where you can go learn more. So additionally, you can download a trial version of OpenEdge Change Data Capture and work with it in your environment. That trial is available on the OpenEdge homepage from the Progress website. So I think we have some time for questions. So let's turn it back over to Tanya to see what questions have been presented.